Welcome back everyone to the recap of game number 2 of the FIDE World Championship match Liren against Gukesh D. And day 2 of the match saw a pretty quick and I would say solid draw. But yeah, there were a couple of surprises. So the first surprise was that Ding started by playing e4, which is not his main move. Throughout most of his life, he was more of a d4 or c4 player. And more recently, he also started to employ e4 in his recent tournaments. But yeah, at least my thinking was that it was more like a way to throw Gukesh's team off and then for the World Championship match to get back to his main opening with d4 or c4. But it turns out I was wrong and he still went for e4. Again, making quite some sense because also his, from at least from what I can tell, his main second, Richard Report, is also mostly an e4 player. Gukesh played e5, so this already tells us something about his preparation. Gukesh was also a big Sicilian player, often going for the Sveshnikov. But in this match, at least with the black pieces, he wants to stay pretty solid from what I could tell. Ding played knight f3, knight c6, and went for the Italian with bishop c4. Gukesh went bishop c5, d3, knight f6, and now the second slight surprise was knight c3. This system has gotten quite popular recently, just to avoid like this main theory with white going c3 and then short castle and later on gaining space on the queen side with b4, a4. And knight c3 leads to pretty different positions. White often has the idea to gain the bishop pair with knight a4, for example, after d6, which is one of the moves white gets the bishop pair after knight a4. After knight a4. But Gukesh went a6, so there are a couple of moves here. a6 is one of them, as I said, d6 as well, just giving up the bishop pair in return for some time, because knight a4, it does require some time for white to actually get the bishop pair. And also there, black is pretty solid. h6 is also one move that now after knight a4, the bishop can retreat to e7. This is also one idea. But Gukesh went for a6, which to my knowledge is kind of like the esteemed main move. Ding went a4, so yeah, also trying to gain space on the queen side. In some cases, also preventing black from going b5. Gukesh played d6, short castle, h6, and now bishop e3. So I guess still kind of a waiting game. Also, I assume that short castle would be a move, but now at least black has to consider bishop g5, which probably here is not that dangerous because black can just go h6 and bishop g4 and then later on maybe take on f3 and then go g5, so there shouldn't be anything happening here. But h6 just trying to avoid bishop g5 once and for all. Ding went bishop e3, and this is kind of the main idea of this whole system. With the knight on c3, it makes a lot of sense often to allow black to take on e3 when after f takes e3 the f file opens up and white actually gets a lot of play, often connected with the idea of knight h4 and later on knight f5. So Gukesh went bishop e6, still being in his preparation, I'm pretty sure. So kind of a strange way of playing now. It's almost a symmetrical position, lots of tension in the center, but both, or at least Gukesh argues, if white were to take all of these trades here, actually a similar position could have arisen in the game, just reversed. And this looks pretty anti-positional, but it turns out that these double pawns and the open d file actually comes in handy in this case for black, and the position looks pretty easy to play here for black because short castle will most likely come, and black does have this idea with knight h5 and then knight f4. Also there's this nice square on d4, and white would like to have this knight on c4, but it does take a long time. For example, knight b1, knight d2, knight c4 would be an idea, but yeah, black has all sorts of ideas. Even black could think about castling long and then to attack on the king side with g5, g4. So Ding, still being in preparation, went a5 fairly quickly. And now what I was saying was that black could also go for this structure as we've seen before here. But also this looks a bit easier for white to play. The position is still objectively balanced, but yeah, after something like short castle, for example, queen e1, preparing knight h4 without allowing knight takes e4. Here, this tactical trick, winning a pawn. Queen e1 first, and now, as I said before, knight b8 is probably the best for black, trying to reroute the knight to c5, but after knight h4, knight bd7, now something like queen g3 Still looks pretty dangerous for black if when knight f5 is coming on the next move. Also, white could double his rooks on the f-file. So understandably, Gukesh didn't want to go for this position. Instead, he castled here, short castle, and now he's just waiting. Maybe at some point he will take on e3. Also, he has idea of bishop b4. What I also wanted to mention was the top engine choice here is bishop b4, but here I'm sure that Ding knew all the in and outs of this position, and it can get very dangerous for black if he doesn't know how to handle this position. So here knight d5 is I'm sure the move Ding intended to play, and knight takes e4 is what black has to do. What I thought during my commentary was that bishop takes a5 also looks very logical, but here knight h4 is very strong, which I totally missed, and the position is already very dangerous for black. Knight f5 is coming, and for example after g6 trying to avoid knight f5, now queen f3, putting pressure on the knight on f6, knight takes d5, c takes d5, and yeah, now these pieces are in trouble. The line continues, knight d4, bishop takes d4, queen takes h4. When after bishop e5, this desperado here, d takes e5, rook a5. White has a much better position due to the better pawn structure. Also, the pawn on c7 can be targeted with rook c5 and queen c3 coming next. So this is just a nice position here for white. Therefore, bishop a5 is not the best here. Knight takes e4 is the computer suggestion, but also here queen d3 the best move, knight c5 and now queen f5. And yeah, the bishop on b4 is still a bit clumsy. I continue checking knight e6 the best so that the bishop can retreat to c5 in some cases. But after queen g4 it continues. White has sufficient compensation here. After short castle again there's this idea with knight h4 followed by knight f5. And yeah, if you're not familiar with this position, it can definitely go in the wrong direction for black here. So Gukesh just castled short, which from a practical point of view is probably a smart decision. And now Ding decided to take on c5, d takes c5, and after b3, until here he was blitzing out the moves, and probably around here his preparation ended. And now Gukesh was thinking for a bit and went for the exchange on d1. Not necessary. I was also thinking about rook e8, which might be logical, trying to prepare knight d4 without dropping the pawn on e5. But Gukesh simply thought that the endgame is nothing to be that afraid of. Rook f takes d1 happened, rook a d8, and here Ding went for rook c1, which is of course a possible move, but according to the computer, knight e1 would have been a better try, but this was very hard to see from the far what happens after rook d1, and knight a5. Because it just looks like black won a pawn for nothing, but here white has some dynamic chances. Knight d3 attacking both of these pawns, forcing knight d7. And here in the commentary, Matthew Sadler, my co-commentator, along with Laura Onuk, suggested knight f4, which is also an interesting move. This discovery here on the knight on d7 and then trying to jump on with the knight to d5. But even stronger would be knight d5, but still the game goes on. c6 was the engine recommendation, knight d7 check, king h7, and now knight b2, another very hard move to spot. Point is, if black wants to defend the knight on d7 with rook d8, now knight a4 is coming, and this pin here will be a big problem for black because knight takes c5 or knight b6 are coming, winning the exchange. Knight f6 is the best for black here, and now rook a1, b6, and f3. And apparently white has good compensation here, not easy to spot from the far. These pawns are somewhat vulnerable. Knight a4 could come at any point, and also the knight on a5 cannot move because the pawn on a6 would drop. For example, rook e8, knight f5, and the game goes on. Looks like there is some pressure for white here. But Ding went rook c1 fairly quickly after 10 minutes of thinking. And yeah, now the position is around balanced, but still white probably has, at least from a practical point of view, the easier play because this pawn on a5 is just very annoying for black, clamping down the queen side. Gukesh went knight d4 and now knight e1. So this is the plan white has to play for all along, trying to get knight d3, but still it's not easy to get knight d3 because in the game rook d6 happened, knight d3 always fails to either knight takes b3 when white loses a pawn, or also knight takes c2 is often in the air. So these two motives are there, and therefore it's not easy for white to actually get knight d3. So Gukesh went rook d6. During the commentary, Matthew Sadler told us that the best move according to Lila here is g5, which was very instructive. Now always if white tries to strengthen the pawn on e4 by playing f3, there will be g4 when black will all of a sudden get a lot of counterplay, but g5 is not a move which is that easy to play for a human, we all agreed on. So Gukesh went rook d6, just trying to prepare doubling the rooks on the d file. King f1 happened. Again, here f3 was probably a bit more logical, but I assume that Ding was maybe trying to avoid g5 and then g4. So he tried to refrain from playing f3 at least yet, because after king f1, if now Gukesh would play g5, white doesn't have to go f3 here, making this target on f3. g6 was played by Gukesh, just slowly improving his position. King could come to g7. Also, in some instances, if the knight moves, then f5 would be a thing to consider now. Rook d1 was played, and here, yeah, to us it already seemed like Ding didn't really see the way to continue here. Probably a better try here would be rook cb1, with the idea that b4 will follow, and then after something like, let's say, black goes king g7 here, b4, c takes b4, rook takes b4, and now the pawn on b7 is a target. But Ding went rook d1, rook f d8, and now finally he decided to go f3. King g7 happened, king f2, slowly improving his position, and now Gukesh played h5, and here we saw a repetition somewhat, surprisingly for most of us, since, Ding now just went knight e2, and here h4 seemed like a very logical move. Of course, the position is still around balanced, but it doesn't seem that easy for black to actually find a plan. And also the pawn on c5 is still a big target. We were thinking that it might be a good idea to reroute the knight. Let's say to e6, so knight h7, knight f8, knight e6 would have been an idea. But after knight h7, now knight a4, it still looks a bit hard for black to defend this pawn. But the computer comes up with knight f8, knight takes c5, and now knight takes c2. The point being, after knight takes c2, black wins the exchange. And if rook takes d6, now c takes d6, when the knight on c2 is hanging, but also the knight on c5 is hanging. And the position is around balanced. Knight e6 check was the best move, knight takes e6 and knight takes c2, or also f takes e6 would be something to consider, with, again, the most likely outcome being a draw. But Ding went knight e2, and after knight c6, we saw a repetition with knight c3, knight d4, and knight e2 back. After knight e2, black could also take on e2 when there's probably not much happening. After king e2, black could trade all of the rooks off, and even though white still has somewhat of the better structure, black can just hold on by knight d7, defending both of these weaknesses, also heading towards a draw. Maybe after knight takes e2, Ding wanted to keep one rook on the board. After rook d6, king takes e2. This, again, could be playable for white, but also here black shouldn't be in any danger. But anyway, Gukesh went knight c6 back, and after knight c3 here, they went for a draw. What he could have tried, Gukesh, was to take on e1, trying to play on, but of course with the black pieces, Gukesh was surely happy with the draw. Now rook takes d1 doesn't work, because after rook d1, knight takes d1, knight takes e5, black simply won a pawn, but Ding surely had in mind knight takes d1, when one pair of rooks is now exchanged, and knight takes a5 doesn't work well, because after rook a5, rook takes d1. Now white can take on c5 with a double attack on the pawn on c7 and the pawn on e5. Still, after rook takes d1, knight takes d1, black could do something like h4. Now, using the fact that white didn't block his activity on the king side with h4, and this position still around balanced, nothing much happening here, so I totally get why Gukesh went for the repetition here, but still, maybe black could have tried to use the momentum when Ding was already clearly happy with the draw, tried to play on, but of course it makes a lot of sense, as I said, for Gukesh to go for the draw by the repetition. So yeah, pretty quick day at the office for both of these players and also for the commentary team, including myself. I'm really looking forward to the game tomorrow with Gukesh having the white pieces again. Will be very interesting to see what both players come up with in the opening, if Gukesh will again go for e4, and after that if Ding will repeat the French defense. So I'm really excited towards that. I will be commenting tomorrow again at 10 a.m. Central European Time with Laura Onuk together. So yeah, if you want to watch that stream, go ahead to Leechess, to their YouTube account or Twitch. Maybe tomorrow I'll also manage to redirect the stream towards my channel. There were some technical difficulties today. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's analysis. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I will see you in the next days.